India, the United States, Japan, and Australia have all formed the Quad. They call it an informal grouping, but it is the most robust and talked about alliance in the last few years. The free world's hopes are pinned on the Quad because it seeks to cooperate in the Indo-Pacific region and counter China. In the last few years, the Quad has crushed China's dreams of world dominance. With their collective military and diplomatic strengths, the Quad has overwhelmed China, and it is only getting started. China knows this and has nowhere to hide from this threat, but it also refuses to mend its rogue ways. So, isolated in all directions, China wants allies desperately, and it is attracting rogue, isolated nations like itself to multiply forces. This is China's own rogue Quad to counter the free world's Quad, and the regimes of these nations are just as hopeless as the Chinese Communist Party regime. So, is this a grand masterstroke by Xi Jinping, or is it a damn squib? Hi, and welcome to TFI Global, the foreign affairs and geopolitical analysis arm of the TFI Media Group. I am your host Shubhangi, and in this video, I will tell you about Xi Jinping's silly answer to the Quad. Let's begin. The international order is going through a churn, and changing alignments as well as realignments have become an order of the day. While the USA has been putting sanctions on rogue regimes the world over, the Chinese Communist Party is desperate to have allies. The Chinese Communist Party has realized that it must gain allies and friends. While the Western countries with their Asian allies are trying to contain China via the Quad, Beijing is trying to create its own Quad with the three rogue nations, namely North Korea, Venezuela, and Iran. Even after being blacklisted by Washington 2 years ago for handling Iranian petroleum, a Chinese logistics firm, CCPC, has emerged as a key player in the supply of sanctioned oil from Iran and Venezuela, according to 7 persons familiar with the arrangements. While China is providing logistical support for oil trade between the two nations, which are under crippling sanctions, it is also indulging in oil trade with North Korea, even though oil export to the country is under the United Nations Security Council restrictions. A North Korean oil tanker made its first stop in a Chinese port after 2017 in mid-April this year. Pyongyang has openly sent a tanker to China for the first time since the United Nations imposed strict sanctions on North Korea's oil imports. All these actions and activities, when observed together, give an idea of how China is creating its own axis of allies, or for the lack of better words, fostering its own Quad to challenge India, Australia, Japan, and the US. According to PDVSA, Venezuela's state-owned oil companies' records and tanker monitoring data, the Hong Kong-registered company has quickly established itself as a key partner for Caracas, chartering ships transporting about 20% of Venezuela's total oil exports in April and May. According to the documents, CCPC did not charter any ships carrying Venezuelan oil in June. According to 2 sources, CCPC has purchased at least 14 tankers in the last year to transport oil from Iran or Venezuela to China. In late May, Iran dispatched 2 Navy boats to the Western Hemisphere, and an Iranian official confirmed the destination as Venezuela on June 1. According to an armaments pact signed last year, the vessels could be delivering missiles and potentially speedboats to Venezuela. This irked the US establishment and gave away that there was some sort of bond developing among these countries along with China. While Beijing is developing a concert of allies in its part of the world and providing a platform for the 2 sanctioned rogue nations, thereby making them extremely dependent on China, it has also started to openly provide oil exports to North Korea without concerns of receiving any flack from the UN and its member countries. As reported by The Diplomat, in mid-April, the North Korean flagged Sinpyeong-2, indicating its position as Seongmyeong-2, reached the Chinese port of Longkou in the country's northeast, where it stayed moored for several days before signaling its return to the DPRK's western coastline. Although satellite footage shows the ship docked closer to a bulk cargo processing facility, it was also only a short distance south of a relatively big oil tank farm, which is commonly seen in publicly accessible satellite imagery. The New York Times claimed in March that a tanker named New Kong visited a separate port along China's southeastern coast on January 1st, 2021. Despite the fact that North Korean oil tankers had not advertised their presence in Chinese ports for years. The New Kong is not registered in North Korea and has been identified as a ship-to-ship transfer vessel by the United Nations panel of experts, which has recommended the ship for UN designation and a global port restriction. Other North Korean tankers and coal smugglers also routinely visit Chinese waters along the country's southeastern coast. Sanctions have wreaked havoc on the economies of North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela, as well as Iran and Venezuela's tanker fleets. According to analysts and publicly available statistics on PDVSA's fleet, the tanker fleets are overstretched and in need of an overhaul. China's banking and direct involvement, on the other hand, has brought respite to these nations momentarily. According to a Reuters survey, Iran exported more than 600,000 barrels per day of petroleum in June. According to estimates based on tanker tracking data, this compares to a high of 2.8 million barrels per day in 2018 before sanctions were applied, but up from 300,000 barrels per day in 2020. But by providing support and consistent assistance to these three sanctions-ridden countries, China is trying to create a concert of allies by collecting the isolated and abandoned rogue nations. These nations are in no position to counter the Quad, but by providing support and consistent assistance to these three sanctions-ridden countries, China is trying to create a concert of allies. But it is a strategy that will not help China fight the free world.